Silver, and I'm here today to talk about what I think is one of the most frequently asked questions in the inner system DID and OSDD community. Is X enough to cause DID? I often see emotional abuse, neglect, bullying, and medical trauma and all sorts of other things substituted in for what X is. And the short answer of are these things enough trauma to cause DID and OSDD is yes. And this is because the formation of DID and OSDD is a lot more than an X creates Y situation. There's no type of trauma that you can substitute in for X that automatically creates DID and OSDD. And there's never a line where above it is enough trauma to have DID and OSDD, and below it you don't have enough trauma and you can't develop DID and OSDD. This is because the development of these traumatic disorders are very much environmentally based. Yes, the trauma is an aspect of it, but whether or not you develop the disorder is highly dependent on the environment you're in. What environmental situation is the child in? Are they in a good, supportive social environment? Do they have a place to talk about their trauma? Do they have people to talk about their trauma with who won't dismiss them and invalidate them? Has this child already gone through a traumatic experience and already have developed some form of PTSD, and this new experience is just laying on top of it? Does an individual have comorbidities that make developing traumatic dissociative disorders even more possible? All of these things have an acute impact on the child that's going through trauma at the time. And due to this, two different people can go through very similar circumstances, and one of them might develop PTSD and DID, and the other one might end up fine and not end up with any traumatic disorders based on the event. And that's why it's so hard to classify things as mild or severe trauma. What might be mild to one person might be severe to another person. And because of that, the classification of trauma as mild or severe cannot be done by the type of event, but is determined by the individual's experience of the traumatic event. Thus, the development of DID or OSDD is all based specifically on individual brain's ability to cope with the trauma that's occurring. The only thing that matters when it comes to the formation of DID and OSDD is that the trauma and stress is repetitive. So fundamentally, the statement, X form of trauma is enough to cause DID or OSDD is incorrect. And a better form of this statement is, if your brain is not equipped to handle X traumatic event, then you will develop DID or OSDD. So overall, it's all individually based, and you can never point to a specific sort of trauma and be like, yes, this always develops DID or OSD, and then point to another one and say, no, this isn't enough trauma, because different people can have different outcomes from the same situation. This concept also applies to the idea of one person's trauma being more than another person's trauma. For example, I see a lot of people around the community feeling invalidated because they haven't experienced as much trauma as another person. And one of my favorite metaphors to explain why this shouldn't be invalidating to other people goes like this. Quick content warning for drowning and death coming up soon. Two different people can drown in two different ways. One person can drown in a small bucket of water or a bathtub, and another person can drown in a whole lake. Does that mean that the person who drowned in a lake had a worse drowning experience or drowned more than the person who drowned in a bucket? No, because at the end of the day, both of them have drowned, and that's what matters. Drowning is drowning, and trauma is trauma. At the end of the day, you developed a traumatic disorder from what happened to you, and that's what should matter, not whether it was more or less than someone else's. So at the end of the day, if you're wondering whether your trauma is valid, or are feeling invalid because someone experienced more than you did and you feel like your trauma wasn't enough, my message to you is your trauma is valid. If you're experiencing symptoms that line up with DID or OSDD, or you've been diagnosed with DID or OSDD, there's a high chance that you're experiencing them for a real, valid reason. And you shouldn't feel invalidated because you think your trauma is not enough to cause DID or OSDD or is less than someone else's. You and your trauma are valid. You are real and you are loved. And I hope you have an absolutely wonderful day.